Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third webinar in SIHA Network's It's Not Your Fault series under the We Cannot Wait project supported by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This afternoon, we are gathered to confront one of the most brutal realities of war and repression across the Horn of Africa, conflict-related sexual violence, CRSV. For too long, women and girls' bodies have been used as battlefields, whether in Darfur, in Tigray, in South Sudan, or elsewhere in our region. CRSV is not only a weapon of war, but a deliberate strategy of repression, silencing, and control. It thrives in contexts where accountability is absent, where survivors face stigma instead of support, and where international outrage has become muted. As we open this conversation, I want to remind us that this is not just about statistics or the legal frameworks. It's about real lives. It's about survivors and families navigating trauma, communities struggling with stigma, and grassroots organizations and movements who are carrying the heaviest burden with very little support. Today's discussion has been designed to do three things: expose the patterns and drivers of CRSV in the region, reflect on where responses have failed, from collapsed protection mechanisms to lack of sustained funding, and lastly, to highlight what is working, the resilience, solidarity, and community-led responses that are filling the void where states and international actors have fallen short. Today, we are honored to be joined by speakers who bring insights from different parts of the region. From Amnesty International, we have been joined by Flavia Mwangovia, who is the Deputy Regional Director, Movement Engagement and Operations, East and Southern African Region. We will hear about the international human rights and legal blind spots and why the world remains numb to these crimes. From Sudan, we have been joined by Adla Abubekar, the Protection Response and Documentation Coordinator at SIHA Network, and she'll be bringing voices from the ground, exposing the lived realities of survivors and solidarity networks that have emerged amid the conflict. From South Sudan, we will be joined by Jacqueline Nasiwa, who is the Executive Director and founder of the Center for Inclusive Governance, Peace and Justice, and she'll be speaking about community-led responses and the ways in which women and grassroots groups are building protection systems, even in the most fragile contexts. I want to remind all of us that this is not just another conversation. It's an urgent call for justice, accountability, and solidarity. And I invite you not only to listen, but to reflect critically, to ask questions, and to leave this space with renewed commitment. Thank you for joining us. And as we begin, I would like to invite all those that are joining us online to please introduce themselves in the chat box. And to everyone joining this webinar today, you are welcome to use the chat function to post your comments or questions throughout the webinar. And you can access this through clicking in the chat icon at the bottom of your screen or using the Q&A function that is available. If you'd like your message to be seen by everyone, please direct it to everyone in the chat. And where you'd like it to be directed privately to a panelist or a participant, you can select that option. We are going to have 120 minutes for this webinar and we'll attempt to accommodate all questions. And if your question is not responded to or answered during the session or after the session, please feel free to reach out to the SIHA team via info@sihanet.org and you'll receive a response as soon as possible. I also want to mention the translation services have been provided. This webinar is being conducted in English with translations in Amharic, Arabic, and Somali. And you can access interpretation through clicking on the globe symbol at the bottom of your Zoom screen, select either English, Arabic, Amharic, or Somali among the list of languages that are available. You're welcome to share content from presentations being made during this event. However, to protect confidentiality and safety of participants, please do not share any identification participants. So let's begin. And I'm going to start with Flavia. Based on Amnesty International's research on CRSV and sexual violence against women, which is used as a tool of political repression and is increasing and escalating. Please share with us what's missing within the international legal and human rights system. What gaps are you seeing in prevention and protection systems, particularly looking at the African context, and that require a response, and where responses have fallen short? What does this look like, and what recommendations can you share with us? Over to you, Flavia.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Good afternoon, everyone. Assuming you're in the same time zone, I think I'm seeing many of us in the similar time zone, so it's afternoon for many of us. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and to speak with all the participants. I can see different hubs with so many people in the rooms, which is super encouraging, especially when it comes to the very important topic we are discussing today. So, Lauren, your question was like 4 questions in one. So I think it's important to just unpick, because otherwise then it becomes a bit ambitious to attempt to respond to all at the same time. I think I'll focus more, I think, on the protection gaps for now. If there's an opportunity later, I'm happy to chime in on what could be happening regionally and internationally in terms of responding to conflict-related sexual violence. So for those who do not know or may not have sufficient information, Amnesty International is a human rights movement. Movement, as the name suggests, it brings individuals and groups from around the world who take human rights violations personally. So just like we are surrounded here by so many people in the different hubs, it's part of the movement of human rights globally and also in Africa, where we're trying to respond to the different situations that are arising. And also for those who may be new to the region, I think we in Africa, we know that it's a tricky situation we are handling. We have about 6 non-international armed conflicts in the region, just looking at East and Southern Africa, not even counting West and Central. So I cover, as part of my role at Amnesty, East and Southern Africa, and currently we are looking at the different situations in Ethiopia, Somalia, South Sudan, DRC, and Mozambique in particular. And one of the unfortunate things around this crisis and conflicts is that sexual violence has become a defining feature, which means when you're looking at when you're looking at sexual violence, you're not looking at it in isolation, you're not looking at DRC in isolation. There may be specificities, but there are also so many connecting dots and so many areas that we can consolidate what we're observing and form our analysis and also begin to reflect on responses. When I look at Sudan, which has been really a focus for us in the last 2 years or so, South Sudan, etc., there are many reflections we can share in terms of the connecting dots. So I'll try and maybe just bring them together as I attempt to respond to the questions that Lauren has asked me to tackle based on the work that Amnesty is doing. I also wanted to just maybe, as I get in there, I do not know if we saw last week that the UN Secretary General released a report on sexual violence. And I think it was so alarming to see that there's a marked increase in sexual violence in conflicts by about 25% worldwide. And in that increase, we are seeing countries such as Congo, Central African Republic, Haiti, Somalia, and South Sudan being captured as some of the most concerning countries where sexual violence in conflict is happening. Also, a country like Sudan, for example, in May 2024, it was ranked 6 out of 34 countries on the Sexual Exploitation and Abuse Index. just to tell you the gravity of the situation that we are looking at in Sudan. Also in Sudan, it was named as the worst protection crisis, with an estimated 12.1 million people, primarily women and girls, at risk of gender-based violence and in need of related services. And this is another concerning statistic, just to paint a picture of what it is we're looking at in the region, which is the Great Lakes and Horn of Africa. So where are the protection gaps from what we're seeing as Amnesty? Because Amnesty, we document human rights violations, not just sexual violence in conflict. We document all human rights violations in conflict. And we use this information to do advocacy and campaigning, and also just to push for justice and accountability, because our analysis in many of these contexts shows us that the weakest link is a question around impunity. We are here where we are simply because for years and years, these violations do not meet any accountability, and those who are perpetrators continue to be emboldened. But now to your specific question, I think in terms of protection gaps, one of the key gaps that we need to address is that of the health and justice infrastructure. In many contexts where the war is happening and conflict is raging, infrastructure civilian infrastructure is really attacked, whether it's shellings, bombing, and things like that. You find that hospitals are no longer existing where they need to exist. So even if you're a survivor of sexual violence and you need to get some kind of fast response, where do you go to? So let alone the challenge of how do you reach the hospital? Where is the hospital? Where is the police station? Where is the police officer that you can trust to be able to take your report? I think we are aware that, for example, in Sudan, at least from our research and the information that's available, is that as of 2024, about 80 to 90% of the hospitals had been completely flattened. And that is quite concerning in terms of ability of women and girls and survivors of sexual violence, who are not limited to women and girls, to be able to access care and medical support. The other gap that needs to be responded to and interrogated is the question around weapons. What is the role of weapons in facilitating conflict-related sexual violence? I think our Amnesty research has been quite decisive on this in terms of just drawing a clear link, especially in the context of South Sudan and Sudan, where we've been continuously pushing for an arms embargo multiple times. And in Sudan, not just the renewal, but also not just to cover the territory of Darfur, but to cover the entire country of Sudan, because we've seen a very clear link between the role of rather weapons and how they're being used to facilitate. Our research in Amnesty has shown that just one of the research, we actually have multiple research on this, that French manufactured military technology, which is incorporated into armored personnel carriers made by the UAE, a violation of the UN arms embargo on Darfur, just to give an example. So that's another area that we really need the international regional community to try and address decisively, so that civilians, especially women and girls who are suffering from the consequences of this, do not continue to suffer. The other area that I think is super important is a question around protecting those who protect. There are people who've put themselves forward to stand in the gap, including as humanitarian work, as we've seen in Sudan with the emergency response rooms, and in other contexts where HRDs, women human rights defenders, journalists, etc., are on the front line. But there's a real huge issue around reprisals and attacks of those who've put themselves forward to stand in the gap. And we can mention plenty of examples, whether it's in DRC, in Sudan. I think even in Sudan, for example, the report that we launched this year around sexual violence also showed how sexual violence was used as a punishment for those who are actually providing frontline support to communities. So as a way to really put down women human rights defenders, nurses, doctors, and so on and so forth, as they continue to respond to the situation. And of course, the other challenge is that of resources, because those on the front line who are standing in the gap also have been hit hard in terms of the resources gap that has come about, especially after the USAID pullout, because many of these small, medium-sized institutions, organizations, or informal or loose coalitions were relying greatly on this kind of resource, but now they've been left really left with nothing to continue to do the work that they need to do. Another huge challenge, which is a protection gap that I think also needs to look at, is the question around access to humanitarian support, especially when it comes to care for those who have experienced sexual violence. And I'll give an illustration so that you understand what I mean by this. And especially when it touches on sexual and reproductive health and rights. When we were doing our research on sexual violence in the context of Sudan, we were doing this research, these interviews between November 2024 and February 2025. And this was for sexual violence cases that had been recorded between April 2023, when the conflict broke out, and October 2024. But believe it or not, when you are speaking to the different survivors at a refugee settlement camp in Uganda, none of them had been able to access medical care. You can count the time lag, April 2023 to February 2025, when we were speaking to them and now documenting their experiences. Some of them were still suffering physical manifestations of that violence, others mental and psychological. So there's a real issue around access. So it's a question around safety. Can I get to it? But is it even there? And it's not just in Sudan, even in Ethiopia, the question around access is really a problem, especially in terms of even the stigma. In certain contexts, you cannot even mention the word abortion or that you want to terminate because of also just stigma surrounding survivors of sexual violence and the kind of backlash that you can face. So I think that is another area that is really important to look at. So as I try and conclude, I'll just bring two other points that I think are important when it comes to addressing protection gaps. And I think it's a question around weak justice systems. And I think we're seeing this a lot in the DRC, where the justice system has really been weakened. It's underfunded, it's interfered with, it's neglected, very little investment and resource around ensuring access to justice. So that means then even if you report, then which justice system will take up your case and address it? And it's not just the justice system, but it's also the absence of the state. In certain areas, they're so rural, there's no police, there's no court, there's no judicial office or national commission or entity that can take up your case, so that you're left now stranded in terms of what to do. And again, that's another one we're seeing in DRC. Lastly, the question around stigma and underreporting. Many of the cases we document, people are so scared of just the reaction of the community. I know in DRC, for example, we had cases where the women were more scared of being referred to as widows because their spouses had been killed than even the question. So the sexual violence is put on the side. They'd rather try and see how will I deal with the stigma of being a widow. It's not even, it's an issue, So now the question is around what is my standing in the community? It's the same thing we're seeing in Sudan and Ethiopia as well. And then of course, lastly, the question around care for children born out of rape. It's a topic that's really little discussed. And I think it's one that really needs to be discussed in terms of long-term protection gaps. Many survivors we speak to are saying, how will we address the question around the children born out of rape? Because husbands are leaving their wives, women are hiding children who are born out of this violence simply because society is not built to even interrogate or even make sense of a child who's born out of sexual violence. And that is a situation that many women and girls continue to suffer. So I'll leave it at that with those few points in terms of the gaps that we are seeing, but I'm happy to come back later and maybe just chime in on the other aspects, especially the regional international response and what is missing, and also some recommendation on how we could take this forward. Thank you, and over to you, Lauren.
Yeah, thank you so much, Flavia, for sharing that broader overview, but also bringing in comparisons to countries like DRC with what's happening within the Horn of Africa region. I will now move on to Adla, who's our next speaker. And Adla, focusing on Sudan, those patterns of CRV look like, how they're emerging across from Darfur to the north to the south. We know these are often marked by abduction, widespread stigma, and a lack of functional protection mechanisms. And yet we see that there's limited funding and collapsing services, with survivors and their families struggling to navigate through these realities. SIHA Network is doing amazing work in Sudan. So if you can also speak to us about this experience, how grassroots women's organizations are able to respond to this high prevalence. Listening in from Flavia, she was just talking about how Sudan ranks on the index. And also if you can highlight some of the challenges to the responses and the protection support that's happening there, and if there are any linkages you can make to solidarity-based responses like community kitchens, emergency response rooms, and grassroots protection networks. I know that's a lot, but we're happy and looking forward to hearing from you on Sudan. Over to you, Adla.
شكرا شكرا جزيلا لورين.
Thank you very much, Lorraine.
أول شيء يعني
Thank you. And good evening, everyone.
وأنا حقيقي سعيدة
And I'm really happy to be
Hello,
here
when I said the
and to
mountain
be
there,
speaking to you
في موضوع بالنسبة لنا
about
في
this
السودان
very
جدا
crucial
جدا
point in
بالنسبة
Sudan,
للنساء والفتيات
and specifically
السودانيات.
for women and
أنا بس
young girls in Sudan.
مقدمة
So I'm just going to
قصرى
be
إنه
quite
إحنا في
brief.
السودان الحرب دي
First of all, in
ده
Sudan,
السنة
the war,
الثالثة
this is the third year of this war in Sudan,
قامت في
and it
23
actually broke out in
بالدعم
2023 and between the RSF, Rapid Support Forces, and the Sudanese Armed Forces.
عملت واقع مرير على
And it
السودان
has created a very bitter
وارتكبت إنه
experience for the
يعني
Sudanese.
في
So
جرائم
we know
يعني
that there have been a lot of
مع
violations
الجرائم
and
ضد الإنسانية
crimes against
يعني
humanity,
ارتكبت في حق السودانيين
and
والسودانيات
which have been committed
المدنيات
against
في
all
جرائم بتاعت عنف
Sudanese.
جنسي وجرائم العنف
We have
الجنسي حقيقي في السودان في الحرب بتاع
specific
السودان هي
violations related to sexual violence
للأسف
in
هي
Sudan.
بتستهدف
Unfortunately,
كل
it
الأعمار النساء
it
يعني من
actually
أطفال
targets
ممكن يكون
people from
عندنا نحن
different
حالات
ages.
وصلتنا
It targets
لعمر
children,
سنة
women,
لحد
girls,
80
and
سنة
it goes
وفي
it
أشكال
ranges
وأنماط
from
مختلفة
very young ages to
قدرنا
80
نرصدها
years of age. And
تم
so we
رصدها
have
في
diverse
الثلاث سنين أو في السنتين
constellations
ونص
of
الفاتت
these sexual
بتمثل
violences.
في يعني الاغتصاب
And
والاغتصاب
we see
الجماعي
that there has
وفي
been
استعباد
collective
جنسي
rapes as
وفي
well. There
حالات
has been
بتاع
sexual
اختطاف تم
enslavement. There
اختطاف
have been
عديد من
abduction
النساء
cases.
والفتيات
Many children
ونحن
and,
برضو
and
وصلنا في
women and
صيحة
girls have
مكتب
been
السودان
abducted.
إنه
And
في
we have
اختطاف
been able to
للنساء والفتيات
document
من سنة
in
من 6
SIHA that
شهور
girls have been
لسنة
disappeared
وحقيقي
from the age
للأسف
of
إنه في
1
مناطق بتاع
onwards.
الحجاز
And
معروفة
there have
كانت
we
في
know that
الجزيرة
within
أو في
areas
الخرطوم وحاليا
such
برضو
as
في مناطق
Jazeera
بتاع
or even in
الحجاز
Khartoum,
هي معروفة للناس الناس الشغالين
we know that
في
these areas have been
الحماية الناس
identified
الشغالين
and there
في
is no protection.
في
There
التوثيق
is
لإجحافات ضد
lots of
النساء
violations of the
في
people who
مناطق فيها
document,
احتجاز يعني عندنا في
and
فاشر في
people have
المحطات
been intercepted
الطبية
in
عندنا
Fashir.
برضو تقارير
We
بتقول
have
واحدة من
reports
المخازن بتاع
which
المنظمات
declare
هي
that
مناطق بتاع
some
هي
of
أماكن بتاع
the
احتجاز قسري
organizations'
للنساء
depots have been used as prisons
يعني
for women.
وللأسف إنه
And unfortunately,
الجرائم دي بترتكب
these
ترتكب يومي زي ما
violations are
كانت
committed on
بترتكب
a
في
daily
الخرطوم وفي
basis
الجزيرة
in
حاليا
Khartoum,
عندنا
in
يومي
Jazeera
تقريبا
State.
بتصنع
Every
حالات عنف
day
جنسي
we
أو
hear
عنف
about
جنسي مرتبط
sexual
بالنزاع تم ارتكابها
violations
من أطراف
uh,
النزاع
but
في
from
دارفور
both
شغال
warring
دارفور
parties
كله
in
في
Darfur
شمال
specifically,
جنوب
in North
كردفان
Kordofan as well as in South Kordofan. These
وترتكب
violations are
يعني
rampant,
في المناطق بتاع
and
انه قاعدات
they are
في
take
بيوتهم
place in areas in
لما
these
يحصل
areas within people's homes as well.
يعني لما الالغام
When
تيجي
the
داخله برضو
forces come into
يدي
a
معسكرات
specific
النازحين
area,
اثناء
specifically in
هروبهم
displacement camps,
من القتال
and
الطرق ما امنه
the
يتم ارتكاب
routes are not safe at
يعني
all.
جرائم بتاع
And so
اغتصابات
therefore these
اغتصاب للنساء
violations are
والفتيات
very,
وحقيقي الحاجة
very
دي
widespread.
بترتكب من كل
So
أطراف النزاع يعني
this
هي
is
بترتكب
committed
من
by
الدعم السريع
both parties.
بنسب عالية أو ممنهجة لكن حقيقي ممكن
The
تكون
RSF
بترتكب من
is
كل
committing these
أطراف النزاع
violations
بس
on
أنا
a
حبيت
more
يعني أخط
concrete
الحاجة دي
fashion. I
نحن
mean,
في
it's
شبكة
used as a
صيحة يمكن
strategy of war,
بجهودنا
but
في
that's not to
الشغل
negate that
بتاع
both parties are actually engaging in these
التوثيق
violations. And therefore,
والاستجابة
documentation is
لجرائم العنف
extremely crucial
الجنسي في حاجة
for
نحن
us
يعني
to be
في
able to
يمكن في شبكة
respond to these
صيحة
sexual
بنلعب دور
violations in
محوري
the most
حقيقي
adequate ways.
التوثيق
And SIHA has been
لجرائم
very
العنف الجنسي
concerned
المرتبط
and a very
بالنزاع
prioritize this issue of documentation because we feel that it correlates with response rates. In terms of our experience as SIHA, we've been really concerned with the survival of the survivors within Khartoum and within Jazeera state. We've tried to work on this in Darfur state and to take account of the different circumstances which prevail within the different areas. And our method has been based on our coordination with our different partners, with different feminist groups, with different units of feminist groups of women who are offering services. And these the way they've been able to offer refuge to some of the survivors. So we really are highlighting the fact that our work has been intimately connected to collaborating with partners on the ground. And these partnerships are extremely crucial, and we've built on these partnerships and tried to develop them within the different states in order to support protectors, doctors, service providers. We've tried to create refuges. We've tried to create safe havens, and we've actually pointed this out in our press releases as well as in our various reports. I also want to highlight that the use of sexual violence as a strategy by the RSF is a throwback to what's happened in the Darfur region since 2003. This is nothing new in Sudan, and therefore I just want to reiterate that. I think that this is a situation that has been taking place for a long time in Sudan, and I think that it's not something that has arisen only in 2023. So we know that we have a lot of experience in SIHA about documenting these violations over the long term. And we've actually managed to document different cases of sexual violations. And after the military coup in October 2021, we actually documented rape cases as well. So we have been able to work on these issues with different organizations in different locations, where in locations where there hasn't been a strong presence of civil society. For example, Jazeera was not a place where there was a lot of civil society activity. It was really difficult to find people on the ground, and therefore we just want to thank the people who are working in the emergency response rooms and the feminist groups who have collaborated with us so closely. We work towards finding responses, and those who have been following our work will know that we are very concerned with creating and with publishing reports on a regular basis, and to actually connecting with the media, and to working with national as well as international organizations. And we work to advocate, and we within our advocacy work, we really focus on highlighting the importance of accountability. Even though working in relation to protection and in relation to advocacy has been challenging, because we've been subjected to bullying and harassment online, we feel that it's extremely incumbent upon us to continue this work and to try and provide these services for the survivors. And in terms of our advocacy, we've highlighted that we need to have holistic protective units, to set them up in order to defend the protectors as well as the survivors. And we cannot do this without finding the collaborations and building up the partnerships which facilitate this work in different areas within Sudan, and in Khartoum, in Jazeera, in Kordofan, in Darfur. We continue to work with our partners,
طيب الحاجة الثانية برضو نحن في الصحة
We also
يعني
highlight in
تجربتنا
SIHA
خلتنا نحن برضو نركز في منهجية التركيز على الضحايا أو
that we
يعني
work
بنسميها
with, we
العرب
prioritize the survivors.
approach. دي واحدة من
This
الحاجات
is a
اللي نحن
survivor center
بنركز
approach.
عليها جدا في صحة.
This is very crucial for
وبالنسبة
us,
لنا مهمة جدا جدا برغم إنه فيها تحديات
even
لكن
though
ده
it is
نحن
very
يعني
challenging,
مركزين عليه بالذات لما نشتغل في الاستجابة
especially
وفي
when we are
المناصرة.
trying to be
واحدة
responsive.
من الحاجات نحن بالنسبة لنا مهمة جدا
So one
سلامة
of the things
الناجيات أو
that is
الضحايا
the
وإنه
importance
ما
of
يتعرضوا
protecting
يعني
the
لخطر
survivors
إضافي بعد ما
so
حصل
that
لهم
they're
الحاجة
not
دي. ودي أنا
re-traumatized
يمكن
and
ذكرتها إنه إحنا
subjected
كنا
to
نقوم بنعمل
further
يعني إلجاء
violations.
الضحايا لأماكن
So we
آمنة
have to
لأنه برضو واحدة
move them to safe
لما كنا
places.
شغالين في الخرطوم بقينا أو
We
في
were working in
الجزيرة
Khartoum, but
حاليا
now, and then
تسجيلات
we
في
worked in Jazeera
كردفان إنه
and
بيتم
in Kordofan,
يعني لو
and we
إحنا ما
realized
قدرنا نطلع
that
الضحية من
if we
السوق
were
اللي
not
بتعرض
able to
لها
move the
الانتهاكات أو
survivors,
في المنطقة اللي فيها القوات بيحصل تاني إنه
we
ممكن
find that there
تعرضوا
is a repeat violation.
لاغتصاب أو لجريمة مرة تانية.
So they
فإحنا
might
مهم
be
جدا إنه نحن
re-traumatized and
نحاول
subjected
إنه
to the same
يعني
crime
نجلي الضحايا
once again.
سلامتهم إنه
So
ما يتعرضوا
therefore, we really focus
للخطر
on
للمرة
protecting
الثانية.
the survivors
برضو
and
من الحاجات
avoiding a further
اللي بنركز
re-traumatization.
عليها في المنهجية السرية التامة
And the methodology is also
وعدم
based on
مشاركة
preserving
المعلومات
anonymity and
يعني بدون يعني
protecting the
من غير ما
identity of the
نستأذن
survivors.
من الضحايا أو لو كانوا هم أطفال إلا من
Specifically,
أوليائهم
as well, we
الأب
focus
أو
on
الأم
protecting
أو
children
الزول المسؤول منهم. ودي برضو
and
نحن
protecting
طورنا فيها
their
إنه نحن
guardians.
يعني عندنا يعني بيقولوا شو بالعربي يا دكتورة الكود اوف لكل الاستاف الشغالين في الموضوع بتاع الحماية أو في الاستجابة والتوثيق. برضو عندنا كود اوف
We
كوندكت
have very
لمقدمين
specific
الخدمات
rules that are
اللي
followed by
بنتعامل
our
معاهم
staff.
بيمضوه عديل بتاع إنه هم ما لازم يشتغلوا الحاجة
So
دي.
there is
الحاجة
a
الثانية
pledge
برضو
of
عندنا
a
واحدة من
complete
الأخلاقيات المهمة شديد الناس
protection,
عارفاها
protecting the
الاحترام. نحن يعني
identities of
الناس لازم
those we are
نتعامل
protecting by
باحترام
the staff and
بكرامة
by those working
يعني
within
من
these
غير
very
ما
difficult
نصدر
and
كلام
challenging and
الضحايا إنك
sensitive
أنت والله ما كان المفروض
contexts.
تطلعي تجيبي عيش
We
دي ما حصل
don't
ليكي
we
دي ما كان لازم
avoid
تشاركي نحن احترام
blame because sometimes we
للضحايا.
find that the community tends to
وبرضو
blame the
عدم
victim
التمييز
by telling
بين
them that they were in
الضحايا
the wrong place
نحن
at the wrong time if
بنقدم
they'd gone
الدعم
out to buy bread, for example.
لكل الضحايا
So
بغير
this
أي
is
تمييز
we are very
من تمييز
sensitive
لا
to this. We
عرقي لا
try
ديني
to be
ولا
as
اجتماعي
equitable and
للضحايا
to
وحتى
exercise
التمييز
as
على
much
أساس إنه
equity
أنت
within the methods that we
المرتكب
deploy.
بتاع الجريمة مثلا لو كانت الجيش السوداني أو دعم
We
سريع أو الميليشيات أو
we
الميليشيات
try to
التابعة
stay
للطرفين.
to maintain a
واحدة
distance
من
from
المنهجيات برضو اللي
labeling
احنا
the
يعني بنفكر
perpetrators,
فيها ودي واحدة
be it the
من
different
الخطط
labels. We try
الاستراتيجية اللي
to adopt a strategy
نشتغل عليها يعني التمكين الاقتصادي
which
للضحايا.
enables
دي
enhancing
بالنسبة
economic
لنا نحن مهمة
livelihoods,
جدا جدا
because this is
عشان
a
هم
very
ذاته يقدروا
important
يستعيدوا
aspect,
سيطرتهم على
so
حياتهم.
that we are able to give these
ودي بتيجي
survivors a
واحدة
sense
من
of
التحديات
agency
اللي
and a
بتواجهنا
sense
لأنه
of
حنتكلم برضو في
ownership over their
التحديات اللي
lives.
بتواجهنا موضوع
And this
التمويل.
is one of the
حاليا
issues that we
نحن برضو
face is an
بنخطط
issue
إنه
related to
المشاريع دي تكون
funding.
مشاريع الحماية تكون فيها
And
خطط
we feel that
وبرامج
the
بتنمي التمكين
the
الاقتصادي
protective
للضحايا
strategies need to
أو
integrate
وبرضه
some form of
ودي
economic
حاجة برضه مهمة مع التمكين الاقتصادي نحن
economic
بنتكلم عن
support,
ضحايا في أطفال
because
ضحايا هم
we know
خارج
that some of the
المدارس.
survivors are actually
وبرضه بنحاول
children.
إنه البرامج بتاع التمكين الاقتصادي دي ما بس
So
التمكين
within that
الاقتصادي إنه
economic
المفروض تكون فيها برامج
enhancement, we
إعادة
try
تأهيل
to rehabilitate
للبنات
some of the
الضحايا
young girls
وبالذات هم البنات الطفلات إنه
and
يرجعوا
to
للمدارس إنه
allow them
يكونوا
to
في
actually
فصول
access
موازية
education once again,
بداخليات
to
بعد
actually
الانتهاء
provide
أو
for some
بنية تحتية
refugees, some
في
dormitories
المناطق اللي كانوا فيها يعني بالذات فيها
within
الاغتصاب زي الجزيرة والخرطوم
specific
حاليا في دارفور.
areas which have
ودي احنا شفنا
now
برضو إنه يعني
which
واحدة
were
من التقارير
once
اللي وصلتنا إنه
battlefields, but which have now
لو
calmed
مسكنا
down
بس ولاية
slightly.
الجزيرة
This is
لما
specifically
المدارس فتحت
relevant to the
لقينا
area
إنه
of Jazeera,
البنات
where the schools
مدارس
have
البنات في
reopened.
واحدة من القرى فاضية شبه
But
خالية.
we
لما
noticed
نجي
that even though
عايننا
the schools have
ونلتقي إنه
opened in one of the
مدارس
villages in the
الأولاد
Jazeera
فيها
state,
في
the school
أولاد
is completely
براميل لكن
abandoned. People are not
مدارس
going to
البنات
school.
كانت شبه فاضية.
We've
فدي واحدة
noticed that
من
there is a
التحديات
reticence for people to take up
في
education.
تركيزنا
So
على
we really
الضحايا
focus on
يعني
the
بنحاول
survivors
يعني نحن
and
نستصحبها معانا
and try to encourage reintegration into the educational system. We think that this is a very important part of our method or methodologies. We try to offer medical support and psychosocial support, but this is a challenge. We don't have the necessity in Sudan. This is challenging. This is a real challenge to preserve confidentiality, because we don't have the spaces which allow this anonymization or this confidentiality. This has impacted our work, specifically in the Jazeera state, because the survivors didn't know where they should go. They didn't know where to go, whether to go to Gadarif in Eastern Sudan. There are no services, and there are literally no infrastructures which will preserve the anonymity and the confidentiality for these people. In the Sudanese law, we also have something called Formula 8, where all crimes have to be reported in order to access health services. And some lawyers might be able to help within the different states of Sudan in order to actually give us access to this form. We've started training. We've trained researchers starting this month, how to deal with the survivors. And some of these people who we've trained have been medical doctors. So I think that this is a very important method that we need to adopt, but notwithstanding, we still are faced by many challenges. It's also important to set up projects and to make sure that the family members of the survivors are actually included in the process and are part of the advocacy efforts. The advocacy programs should focus on the wider communities. Also very important is that we set up activities with the local communities. And this allows us to alleviate the stigma which is associated with sexual violence. And this is the title of this very important series. We really need to focus on diminishing the impact of stigma. So we've created mobile clinics, and we have been moving within the different schools, specifically within Jazeera state. We've worked within the female-led communal kitchens within Darfur, in order to provide a platform which actually speaks about these violations more openly. And we think that the communal kitchens have been safe spaces where it's been easy to interact with the local communities. And they have contributed largely to reducing the weight of stigma. The challenges that we face as SIHA in relation to our response, first of all, is related to funding, and specifically funding which is directed towards protection. And we know that the funding towards the humanitarian crisis in Sudan has been lacking, to say the least. And we know that the funding targeted towards protection has really been very, very limited. And we are working at our utmost in order to find the funding avenues, but we are not able to cover all the needs. And we know that the stigma within these communities is really one of the primary challenges. And we know that the services which we have been able to provide do not meet the needs of the violations because of the social stigma. This is something which has been documented in our reports. And we know that the infrastructure has been a major challenge, the complete destruction of the infrastructure within the country. And we have security challenges as well. And it's also another challenge that we're faced is the fact that there is an escalation of the conflict and escalation of the war in Kordofan, specifically in Darfur. These are really some of the primary challenges that we're facing. And I think as the war becomes more and more widespread, we realize that there is a heightened risk of separation taking place. So therefore, this funding issue is a real headache for us. And we a final challenge is the lack of any accountability or any judicial response and questioning or holding the perpetrators to task is one of the problems. So this is just a brief outline, and if you have further questions, I'm happy to respond.
Thank you so much, Adla, for sharing that detailed account of what's happening in Sudan and the experience and work of SIHA Network, which is one of few organizations that never left and continue to document these heinous violations. Before I go to the next speaker, I would like to encourage every one of us to use the chat to contribute to this conversation. If you have any questions or comments, or if you'd like to share your work, experiences of what you're doing, what's working, what strategies are being employed, depending on where you're joining us from, please use the chat function to do that. I would now like to invite Jacqueline, who's going to be speaking about South Sudan and sharing with us what community-led interventions have proven effective when it comes to preventing and responding to CRSV there, particularly focusing on IDP camps, POCs, and rural communities. And we also know that there are a number of existing initiatives within South Sudan. You can share how some of these initiatives have overcome any challenges around stigma, which has also been highlighted by Adla and Flavia as one of the key challenges, issues around resource scarcity and any collapse of the services. It's really good to understand and what needs to be done. So over to you, Jacqueline.
Okay, thank you very much, Lauren, and good evening to all the participants and my panel members. I'm so happy to be on this panel to discuss this important and critical topic of conflict-related sexual violence. And for this matter, focusing on South Sudan. And what I'll say is that the patterns of sexual violence are not different from the one probably that happened in Sudan and also the one that happened in Ethiopia, Somalia, and maybe in other conflict contexts. And largely also like in other contexts in South Sudan, perpetrators are not held accountable. And for instance, from 2024 to date, we have more than 145 reported cases of survivors, and only sadly 12 or 46 are tried, and then 12 are concluded. And this shows the pattern of how impunity is still largely unaddressed in regards to conflict-related sexual violence. And I think if you can recall one incident that happened in 2018 in Bentiu was where we had more than 150 victims within a period of 12 days. And that was so alarming. And as civil society, we mobilized and we held a protest in Juba, where we were able to submit also our request to the parliament, to the Minister of Gender, demanding for justice for the victims. And until today, there is no justice provided for victims in Bentiu. We also take note that the patterns of communal violence is also increasing, and these communal violence are led by militia groups or armed youth. And in this context also, from last year, we had 45 victims or 46 victims registered. And this year it has increased to 147. So you could see that the pattern is also increasing in terms of the militarized communal violences. And these are also not largely documented, even no trial processes are held, and victims are largely living without justice and no reparations for them. Recent cases in WOW, and I think this is where also SIHA has presence, and the General Court Martial was just concluded and supported by UNMISS, and there were only 2 cases of conflict-related sexual violence that are brought before this court. In Yei, in 2002 and 2020, we registered also a number of cases of conflict-related sexual violence. And in the last trial, only 4 were brought before the court. So this shows the challenge that conflict-related sexual violence victims have in regards to access to services, access to justice, and also in terms of the stigma that they live with in the community. One important thing is that in South Sudan, the government initiated the gender-based violence and juvenile court to try cases of gender-based violence. However, this court is only attending to cases of domestic violence or gender-based violence in the contemporary setting, but not looking at issues of conflict-related sexual violence. And most of the cases of the sexual violence nature in conflict are tried with the military justice, which is the general court martial. And experiences have shown both in South Sudan and also in other contexts that trial of civilians in these courts have not yielded justice for them because of the toxic environment, the stigma that victims face when they meet with their perpetrators or adversaries, and then they don't report. For instance, in the week of the trial in Yei, where I was also there to do the observation, we had like 19 cases of CSRV, and the trial was going on, and only 4 cases were brought before the court. And one of the recommendations that I put forward, and together with other observers, is that there should be a lot of awareness raising by communities and by civil society, and the military should be working closely with these stakeholders if they want to see that more cases are brought before the court. And protection of the victims and witnesses remain paramount before the trial, during the trial, and also after the trial. Some of the victims I spoke to, what they stated is that when they go to the military barracks, sometimes they face intimidation. And I also spoke to one of the advocates who was the lawyer for the victims. He was also facing challenge and harassment. So protection of the witnesses and the victims during that process was very important. The mental health of the victims remain crucial in these trial processes. For example, some of the victims, because of the cultural issues that South Sudanese customs put on women, where issues of sexuality are not discussed, and a woman who is a victim of sexual violence is perceived as less human and of less value. So women fear also to report, or they fear to show up in the court that here they are. And the recent worst experience was when we had our transitional justice process for nomination of panel members for the transitional justice. We had an incident where we brought survivors, and in the room, one of the policymakers asked, like, who are the survivors? Can they get up? And he didn't believe that they were survivors. And I think what saved us was that none of the survivors was able to raise up a hand, or no one was pointing at them. So you could see the humiliation, the stigma that vulnerable groups like survivors are facing, and for this matter, conflict related because of exposure and also lack of protection for them. Um, what did we do as civil society and with the Center for Inclusive Governance, Peace and Justice? We held a number of activities with survivors. First, we mobilized survivors to be able to form their network. And today in South Sudan, we have the Survivor Network of South Sudan, which is registered at the national level. And it has more than 500 survivors of CSRV. Uh, we work in 6 locations in Bentiu, in Yei, Bor, and in the POC, in Juba, and also in Juba town. And we focus mainly on conflict-related sexual violence. And these victims, they form groups at the subnational level, and they also have their national secretariat. And we do training for them on understanding CSRV, the impact, and also trauma awareness and counseling for them. They do it at the group level and also at the individual level. And these survivors are taken through the transitional justice process, which is part of the peace agreement that is signed, and for them to understand what role they can play in the transitional justice or peace processes for that matter, and what are their rights and what are their the challenges that if these transitional justice mechanisms are established without them, and then they cannot be able to get justice. So we adopted the survivor-centered approach for survivors to understand what it means and how they can be able to protect their rights in these processes and also to share their views in these processes. So we do what we call the legal awareness session with the survivor and with survivor advocates, and they go back to their communities and also empower other survivors and community leaders on issues of protection and also rights of survivors to remedies. We supported these survivors with medical referral and emergency support, and also with income generating activities. This is so because we believe that economic empowerment of survivors will also be sustainable for them, and it will help them to support their families, and particularly for mothers who are having children born out of rape. And for the children, we also support them with school fees, like around 60 of them. And the events, but the mothers are taken through counseling
Jacqueline, I
processes
think we
so
cannot hear
that
you.
they will understand that it's them who can give love to these children, and it is them who can protect these children. Finally,
Jacqueline, I think we cannot hear you. Your connection is bad. I can see a comment in the chat. So as we get you back, Jacqueline, I think we can, there are a number of comments that have come in the chat. Thank you so Council 2 days ago, and how these were frustrated by Russia, objecting some of the measures and mechanisms that had been put forward around CRSV. Thank you for contributing to the conversation. Susan, Victor, you have raised an important question asking about Amnesty International's distribution and dissemination channels, and that will be responded to by Flavia directly in the chat. There are a number of comments that are coming in Arabic. Adla will be able to respond to those if there are questions or comments. Thank you so much for those of you that are contributing to this conversation. I know Jacqueline has been struggling with her internet connection because it's raining in the location where she is, but we'll give her an opportunity to conclude in a minute or two once she confirms that her internet connection is stable. At this point, I would like us to go to our poll question. We have a poll question and would like all of you to contribute to this conversation. So it's going to appear for those that are online. There is a QR code and there is a link that you can click on and respond to this question. And for many of you that are joining our in-country hubs, these will be provided to you by the in-country facilitators. And the question is, in your view, what is the most urgent gap in addressing conflict-related sexual violence in the Horn of Africa region, and where should efforts focus to drive real change? I will repeat the question. In your view, what is the most urgent gap in addressing conflict-related sexual violence in the Horn of Africa region, and where should efforts focus to drive real change? We have 5 minutes to respond to that question. Please feel free to access the question in any language that you are comfortable responding in. We have the question translated in Arabic, in Amharic, in Somali, and it's also in English. So I'll give us 5 minutes to respond to the poll question. Reminding us that we have 3 minutes to respond to the poll question, and it's accessible for those that are online. There is a link that you can click on or a QR code that you can use. And for our participants that are joining from the in-country hubs, reminding you that we have facilitators on ground to provide the questions to you. We would like to hear from you on what you feel the most urgent gap is in addressing CRSV across the Horn of Africa region, and where should efforts focus to drive real change? I have received confirmation from Jacqueline that her internet connection is now stable. So Jacqueline, in less than a minute, if you can conclude, I know you are making your final statement. So if you can go ahead and make that final statement.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. I think my final statement will be the recommendation, which is to strengthen the justice institutions and improve access to services for survivors. The other one is to integrate psychosocial support in our interventions with survivors and ensure that we adopt the survivor-centered approach in our work. Legal awareness and legal reform is very important. Currently, we are working on the anti-gender-based violence bill. And I think for the other countries also, if they can start pursuing anti-gender-based violence bill that will incorporate CSRV cases.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Thank you for concluding. And we do understand the challenges in this part of the region with internet accessibility. So we are glad that you were still able to join us and conclude with your intervention. So at this point, we have listened to the speakers from across, and I would like to open this conversation up to us. If you have any questions or any comments, feel free to let me know. For those of you joining online, please, you can put your hand up and the host will allow you to unmute yourself and ask a question. And if you're joining from any of the in-country hubs, please do let me know and we'll be happy to give opportunities for questions and answers to the panelists. I do not see any hands up. Okay, there is a hand from Juba in South Sudan, and then we'll go to Hargeisa in Somaliland. So we'll start with Juba in South Sudan hub. Over to you guys. And if you can address the question to any of the panelists, that would be great.
Okay. Thank you. Actually appreciate this conference. And just I have a comment that to end this conflict related to the sexual violence, it is need us to establish sustainability programs which can reduce this conflict, because the sexuals related to the conflict or the violence, it is just as a reflex or the result, but the cause is a situation. So let us avoid that situations and put a clear, sustainable program to reduce the conflict. And thank you.
We will allow one more comment from Juba.
Okay, شكرا جزيلا. أنا اسمي
My name is Lily Nelson.
من Association for Media Women in South Sudan.
My question is, my first question is directed towards Sudan, to Adla. We know, Adla, we know what's happening. We know that there is extreme violence in Sudan and that the situation is terrible. And you've explained that there is a lot of violations which are affecting the children and the women. And this is sexual violence. But you have been reticent about offering us the statistics. So we'd like to know a bit more in order to get a bigger picture. So maybe if you could just give us more statistics that would be useful, because Jacqueline actually gave us cases. She said that in Bentiu we had 150 cases. Therefore, there was more responsiveness to finding solutions on the basis of the statistics which were provided. The other question relates to what Flavia has said and what Jacqueline has said. Flavia spoke about termination of pregnancy, specifically during periods of conflict. But we know that a lot of countries have legislation which actually prohibits termination of pregnancy. But the question that is constantly perplexing us, is it easier to terminate a fetus, or is it better to allow the child to be born and then the child will be murdered as a born child? I personally, Lily, my personal opinion as Lily would be to actually terminate an unwanted pregnancy earlier. And I think it's better to terminate the pregnancy and not have an unwanted child who will be stigmatized and mistreated. And I'd also want to address the issue about the gap. What can we do? I think that from the three presentations, there's an issue related to the judicial systems in Sudan, in South Sudan, and in the Horn of Africa. There's a problem in terms of protection. There's a problem in terms of protecting lawyers as well as the victims. So I think that SIHA and other organizations should actually provide funding and resources in order to provide for rights on the basis of robust legal systems. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Juba.
My name is Esther.
Anna, it's me, Esther.
Yeah, please go ahead, Esther.
I just want to ask, pose 3 questions. About what's been said in Sudan, in Congo, in other areas. Yeah, we haven't received any statistics. So how are you actually working? Which methods are you using? Because we haven't had any statistics.
Because we know
that those who are deaf, those who are blind, do you have any statistics related to people with special needs? What strategies are you actually adopting?
Thank you. That's the last one from our end.
All right, thank you so much, Juba. Let's move on to Hagesa before we come to the panelists, in case there are similar questions that are being asked. So Hagesa, you have 1 or 2 questions maximum.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. كسر هذا هرجيسة عاصمتي هرجيسة Somaliland.
To all of you, welcome to Hargeisa. I'm really blessed to be here.
حاول الكريم ودن قرينا تكتو كل كفسي دحيا جديل بعد دحيا دعتي بدن بعد
Really, we know that in the place that we live in, there are a lot of violence, especially rape, gender-based violence. We also know that women are also very vulnerable to this issue. Some women in the areas we live have experienced theft, where they have been traumatized by the thieves. Also, we know that like some of us are still traumatized by the civil war, by the Somalia civil war in the late 90s. But as a woman, we are very clear on this issue, and also we really sometimes talk about the issue of unwanted pregnancy, the issue of sex and sexual-based violence, and we try to provide a safe space for these girls and for these women to be treated well and for them to be reintegrated to society and to be protected. We know that the most vulnerable areas that experience this issue are the IDP camps, and we try to provide an alternative source of the victims so that they can support their families. We try to also provide education services for their children so that they can continue learning as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for sharing that from Hargeisa, Somaliland. I would like to pass this on to Adla. If you can respond to some of the questions, comments that have been raised, and then to Flavia. And for those of you contributing to the conversation in the chat, thank you so much. So Adla, I'll give you 2 minutes.
شكرا لورلين
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for all these questions. There are some repeated questions specifically about the statistics. I haven't actually mentioned any statistics that we have documented because I tried to just stick to the points that were suggested for me to address, and therefore my intervention was limited to these points. But in relation to the statistics, I don't want to say that the statistics aren't important. And we've said this before in several press releases and in our different interventions. The numbers of there is it's the tip of the iceberg, basically, in relation to the statistics of the sexual violence victims. We know that we have statistics, but we know that we have statistics which are missing. We know that anything that we have in terms of documentation is only the tip of the iceberg. As I've said, we have mentioned that we have an increase of sexual violence cases on a daily basis. On the increase, we have an increase of at least 2 cases per day. So if I give you a statistic, tomorrow is going to be a different statistic, and the day after, it's not something which is static. However, let's say a week ago, we had 450. If we look at the data today, it might be 500 cases. People are documenting, people are doing this very vigilantly and very thoroughly. So I just want to confirm that we have at least 450, but I know that this is not the right figure. The figures are increasing. It's happening in the north, it's happening in North Kordofan, it's happening in Darfur. In any area where there is conflict, we have accompanying sexual violence. So this is something that I just want to highlight and to reiterate this point. I also want to go to the point of what the different militias are doing in relation to the actors and the perpetrators, the identity of the perpetrators. We have this precise information, whether it's RSF, whether it's Barra ibn Malik militias, whether it's the joint allied forces. We have the statistics, but I did not want to mention these specific figures because I really really just wanted to stick to specific points which were sent to me. Also about targeting militias and targeting groups which have been designated as terrorists. We've actually published 4 or 5 reports in relation to what's happened in Zamzam camp, in relation to what's happened to women in Darfur, in relation to what's happened to women in Khartoum state. We have these reports and we do publish them. If you want to leave me your email addresses, I can actually share these reports, which have already been published, specifically in relation to these violations and specifically in relation to the Darfur state. As for the protection of those who are protecting survivors and those who are on the front lines, this is one of our concerns. And this is very important. It's a pivotal point for our work. And we are trying as much as possible to actually protect the women who are protectors and the women who are at the front lines, and to protect the women who are working within these areas. This is how we try to evacuate these areas if we feel that the risk is too high. So we have a protection plan at play. We work with a heightened sensitivity towards these protective measures to enabling protection for people who are working in real time.
Thank you, Adla. 2 minutes for you, Flavia, to respond to the question.
Shukran.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think a couple of reflections. There's a question from, I think, Suzanne Victor on the chat around whether we work with local organizations when we're doing our work as Amnesty. Yes, we do. We really value partnerships and working with the domestic human rights ecosystem, women's rights networks, women-led organizations. We do this in Sudan with partners in Ethiopia, in South Sudan and others. And it's so good to see Jacqueline on the call as well, because I know we've done some work together on South Sudan as well on this issue. So we also really champion the, working through survivors, including on advocacy, because you asked a question around whether we are able to work with them to be able to advocate directly. Yes, that's our philosophy. It's how we believe change will happen, by knowing when to lead, when to follow, and when to collaborate alongside others. So I'm happy to share more experiences if we have time. And then there was a comment around, I think from Lamia, around the UN Security Council. I think even on I didn't have time, but in response to one of Lorraine's questions around the international and regional system, I think for me that's one of the most critical feedback that I have, is that we are increasingly having a weakened multilateral system. One where we have a stalemate literally at the UN Security Council. You mentioned the veto by Russia, where it's impossible, almost difficult. It's very difficult and almost impossible to push through action, decisive action on what's happening in the region, simply because of the international system that's really increasingly politicized. And it doesn't help now. We are also in an era where it's more about the deals. Which deal can which country make with the other country? Which deal can the US make with the DRC? Which deal can country X make with Sudan? As opposed to really centering values and norms that we used to know that international law and the international human rights system stands for. So that's one of the biggest challenges currently that I think we are facing as humanity. The international order is greatly eroded, and we are struggling to find values to define how we interact with each other. And then the other point around that is also the inability to sustain international investigations. For example, the situation on Ethiopia with the International Commission of Human Rights experts on Ethiopia. The mandate was terminated, and yet we know very well that violations still continue to happen in Ethiopia, including on sexual violence. So soon we'll have the UN fact-finding mission on Sudan in September that is due for renewal. Its mandate is ending, but I know it will be a fight in Geneva to get that investigation mandate renewed. So that's another challenge that we are facing. A last reflection on the question on abortion. I think I think someone even answered in the chat that even, for example, in Ethiopia, the legislation is quite, it allows termination on various grounds. So different constitutions and legal frameworks across the world, across the region, have different parameters. And Jacqueline has given the situation of South Sudan on the parameters that exist within the law and the constitution. But that's not even the big challenge. The challenge is really even being able to access it, also due to the social norms. You can have a very permissive legislation or constitution that's very conducive for situations such as this, but the community-based, societal-based norms may prevent you from being able to do that. And some of our work in Ethiopia is showing us how this is really an issue around women accessing sexual and reproductive health and services in the context of sexual violence in the conflicts that are going on. So that is it for me for now, Lauren. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Flavia and Adla. And I see there are a number of questions that are coming in the chat. Adla, if you can go to the chat and respond to that. There is a question from Jared Wedge Thomas. Jacqueline Nasiwa, there is a question from Nunu Diana. And there are other questions and comments coming in. I will encourage our panelists to go to the chat and respond to some of those questions that are coming in. We would like to now hear from a number of voices across the Horn of Africa region. We've had several organizations sitting together and thinking about what CRSV looks like in their context, and also, just thinking together around what strategies need to address this particular heinous crime. So I will start with Ethiopia. Feven, if you are there, just share with us summaries of the conversations you've been having at Addis level around this topic. We do not hear you, Feven. Okay. I think you're coming.
Morning, everyone. Just to reflect on some points. The first one that we have discussed was about the manifestation during recent conflicts, especially to see the setting of the context, specifically conflict-related sexual violence in Ethiopia. So when we discussed, we raised that it's not a new in Ethiopia, since it goes with patriarchal system wherever it is. So what's new is scale and visibility during recent conflicts. The other point that we raised was support efforts exist with some organizations and committees working to assist survivors through this still these are still limited compared from distance reports to lived reality. In the past, we mainly read or heard about conflict-related sexual violence cases. Today, we are witnessing them directly, listening to survivors' stories in regions such as Afar, Tigray, Oromia, and Amhara. Also, reports from Ethiopian Human Rights Community that the violence caught communities unprepared. In addition, complex community perceptions were also raised. For instance, in some areas, children conceived through conflict-related sexual violence are stigmatized and labeled as the enemy child. In other areas, survivors may feel proud if the perpetrator. This duality reflects the deep trauma and the division caused by conflict-related sexual violence and the community perception to it. In addition, urgent need for prevention and care. Without strong prevention, psychological support and reintegration service, both mothers and children risk carrying long-term trauma. If left unaddressed, this trauma can manifest in violence and harm families and communities. Victims of perpetrators. This is challenging in identifying perpetrators during monitoring and investigation of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. It was raised that in most cases, it cannot be clearly established who the perpetrator are, but the perpetrators are in which group are most responsible for conflict-related sexual violence. In addition, the other challenge is gaps in coordinated response. Different responses has been made, at least it has been tried. Just to mention one, Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, they have observed that the survivors often receive no formal response beyond trauma healing efforts. So this gap prompted that the Commission to advocate for more comprehensive responses. Accountability is particularly difficult in conflict setting where infrastructure is weak or absent. In such context, transitional justice becomes essential. The other point is also need for coordinated survivor support. Survivors require coordinated service for healing, as many face secondary trauma and victim blaming from their own communities. So addressing stigma is as important as addressing the violence itself. Sexual violence as a war crime. The conflict has demonstrated that women bodies being used as a battlefield, making conflict-related sexual violence a deliberate tactic of war and grave violation of international humanitarian law. The other point that we gave priority because of the time was on the priority for regional solidarity and action. So here, for the one point that we raised is listen for regional response to be strengthened. The other one is the urgency of seriousness. Conflict-related sexual violence and other conflict-related harm must be treated with the seriousness they deserve, both as a human rights violation and as a threat to peace and stability in the region. The other one and the final point that we raised is regional platforms must do more. Existing platforms such as IGAD are not giving sufficient attention to conflict-related sexual violence and the protection of women and girls. So stronger political will and prioritization are urgently needed. These were the points that we discussed.
Thank you so much, Fevan, for sharing, summaries of your conversation in Addis Ababa and for contributing to this conversation. I would now like to go to Wow in South Sudan. So, Linda, over to you. And after Linda, we will have Flora from Juba. Linda, we don't hear you. Is there a microphone in WOW?
Yes, I'm Linda Ferdinand Hussein from WOW. Like any other state in the Horn of Africa, also in Western Baragazal, we experience CRSV. Here, I want to reflect on the context and the effects, the lesson learned, and recommendation. Why CRSV happening in war? Because the abuse of power, abuse of human rights, gender inequality, lack of accountability, fear, lack of information, such as adequate resources, fund, infrastructure, lack of accessibility, economic hardship, tribal conflict, and discrimination. And also lack of support, lack of women support movement. This is the context where the CRSV is happening. And looking into the effects, we say there is forced marriage, school dropout, pregnancy, forced pregnancy, or unwanted pregnancy, which resulted into children born out of rape, sexual transmitted diseases, forced prostitution, trafficking and sexual exploitation, rape, and kidnapping. Coming to the success history, we also want to reflect on some good stories which happen here in our area, and it is contributed into the issue of the conflict-related sexual violence. Number one is military justice. Recently in war, we have this martial court, and it addresses the issues of GBV committed against women by some military people. 2 cases were tried, and the sentence was accepted by the victims. 2 is provision of security through deployment of police forces, which is 112, and it helped in the return of the IDPs to their homes of origin. Number 2, the mobile court. The GBV mobile court in Juriva and Raja counties addresses this issue of GBV and convicted of the offenders. These are some success histories we appreciate it. In regard to the cases of conflict, sexual related violence. Recommendation is as follow. Number 1, enforce security roles in the protection of civilians. For example, declaration of the state of emergency in the terrible condition or areas. Number 2, night patrols. 3, deployment of security forces in the conflict zones. Detention of the offenders. Provision of humanitarian services like psychosocial support, awareness raising in IDPs and the host community, protection of GBV survivors through case management, monitoring and reporting, creating of hotlines to report immediate cases of GBV, establishment of GBV mobile court all over South Sudan, enforce law, reparation of victims, reparation of victims. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow. We love the summary and recommendations and see how pick those up. I now want to move to Juba. Flora, please share with us a summary of what's happening in Juba. As Flora is coming to the mic, I would like to request Somaliland, if you can get ready with your summaries, that would be lovely. Over to you, Flora.
Okay. Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. And as we have heard from the presentation and also the response from our participants, they are saying that we have been experiencing this case a lot in our communities, and we feel that a lot has not been done, despite of a lot of awareness being raised, but we still feel that the gap is still huge, and especially looking at the persons with disability in terms of inclusivity. In most time when we are giving reports, we don't give a clear estimate of how much or how many of them have been experiencing this sexual gender-based violence. So it's just been mentioned broader. And we have also seen that there is a weak system, legal system in the country whereby the perpetrators will not be put in prison or maybe brought before the law. And in most time, the survivors will not get justice. And they feel like the system is not working at their favor. So I think that's a brief I can give from the side of Juba team.
Thank you so much, Flora, for that summary.
And maybe, yeah, maybe the last thing they said about the absence of victim survivors and protection in the country. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Flora. And I think I saw Jacqueline Nasiwa in the chat talking about a victims and witness protection policy that is being drafted and developed. So hopefully in her concluding remarks, she can speak to that work and connect our colleagues in the Juba Hub to what's happening there. So I would like to move to Somaliland. So if we have Hamid ready, over to you. As Uganda gets ready, we will have Grace, who is an online participant joining in from Uganda. I'm speaking to the experience of the LRA insurgency and CRSV. We can hear you. Please go ahead.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. waxaan magacaygu waa Hibaaq Faysal Axmed, waxaan ka soo hadlayaa Somaliland caasimadiisa Hargeysa. really aad baan ugu faraxsanahay inaan kasoo qayb galo miitinadan oo kale oo aad ugu muhiimsan bulshadeena. waxaan ku bogaadinayaa dadkii qabanqaabadan ka dambeeyey. aad biyo aad baad u mahadsantihiin. waxaan soo koobayaa anaga wadankayga Somaliland 1980kii dagaalo sidan oo kale oo ka jira sida Sudan oo kale ayaa soo marnay, ka dhashay dhibaatooyin aad u badan, kufsi, tacaddi iyo jirdilba. alxamdulillaah iminka aanu ka dhammaanay. waxaan aad ula dareenahay walaalaheena Sudan allah dhibaatada ka dulqaado iyo meel kasta oo dumarkeenu ku dulman yahayba inuu ilaahay ka qaado dhibaatadaas waxaan kusoo koobayaa 5 qodob oon doonayo inaan kaga qayb qaato kow waa wacyigelin in la sameeyo moor wacyigelina oo lakaga hadlaya dhibaatada ay leedahay kufsigu iyo in tacaddi lagu sameeyo dumar iyo caruurta iyo maatidaba xeerka labaad xeer ilaalin adag in la helo oo xeer ilaalin adag la helo sharci adag oo ciqaab ah qofkii kaysta kufsiga oo qof dumara amba ilmo amba bulsho dhibaato u geystaba in loo mariyo xeer ciqaabeed aad u adag in la ilaaliyo daryeelka caruurta iyo hooyada oo loo sameeyo laga caawiyo diiniyan loo dhiso taageero in la siiyo la gacan qabto sidii inuu ugu dhicin maadaama hadduu qofkaasi dumarku ku dhaco dhibaatadu ay u geysato maskaxiyan aqliyan iyo jismiyan bay u saamayso waxaan odhan lahaa in laga qayb qaato oo la dhiso maskaxdooda si aynay nolosha uga dhicin waxaan kale ku soo koobi lahaa bulsho midaysan dumar midaysan meel kasta la joogo jinsiyad kasta uu yihiin dumarku midoobaan oo iska garab istaagaan oo iskacan qabtaan oo aad looga taxadiro in lala kulmo tacadiyadaas oo kale meel kastuu qof dumar ay ku dulman tahayba aad baa mahadsantihiin inaad dhegeysateen waanan idinku mahad celinaya
Thank you so much. And our last representative from the online participants is joining in from Uganda. Grace Sacheng, over to you. You have 3 minutes to speak about Uganda's experience and what the movement and women's rights organizations did during the LRA insurgency in northern Uganda. So Grace, over to you.
Thank you for giving me this space. Listening to the conversation since the start of the meeting, I must say I feel blessed to be here and would like to share with you a brief background of northern Uganda where the LRA insurgency took place. My name is Grace Achan, not Grace Achen. I'm one of the survivors of LRA that was taken from a school and have been, after surviving, I came and started as an organization that works for survivors, especially women survivors of sexual violence conflict. And mostly what has been done, yeah, I must say government has done their part. NGOs have done their part through their programs that I can list, through targeting education, targeting livelihood, targeting medical rehabilitation, but I must say that has not been enough. The number of victims are a lot, and they still struggle. And so in this sense, it worked out, yes, for medical rehabilitation for those who really needed it and were able to reach medical facility or specific NGOs or medical facilities. But I must say, it did not work very well. Target CRS. All these programs that I'm talking about, whether by the government or by the NGOs, talk generally about victims of conflict. Bearing in mind that CRSV survivors have unique challenges that should be uniquely addressed, and this has not been done in northern Uganda. All these programs we hear about is directly, it's general victims, whether males, whether victims of conflict generally. But what we like to see is a program that will come specifically for survivors of conflict violence, sexually related violence. When we talk of justice, what do we mean? Allow me to give my view. Justice for survivors in the context that I work and I've experienced, justice is not just the legal one. Justice is social. If we end stigma, it is social. if you give psychosocial support, it's justice to a survivor of conflict-related sexual violence. When we give a means of livelihood, that is it, because there is one that is justice to a survivor, a CRSV survivor. For example, when we all know that CRSV breaks down a woman in several ways. If someone who was working, the person loses the work. Generally, in the community, the person cannot live. So that alone can lead to a breakdown, like a breakdown of someone that needs a specific approach, which I will come to. And I will not go logically, but I will keep on hinting the important things that I feel is necessary in addressing CRSV. Let me give, there is one approach that is called holistic approach, which is one way of tackling this CRSV. As I mentioned already, when someone, a survivor, experiences sexual violence, first of all, in our context of Africa, someone is not worthy anymore. As in northern Uganda, as I speak, most survivors have not gone to marriage as a result of stigmatization, either of their children from their marital places or instigation by community members, that, or even mistreatment of a child born as a result of conflict. And so these deter most mothers from getting married, let alone the work. For example, in the context of northern Uganda, most of survivors of CRSV they were all when they were still young, so their education was tampered with, and on return after, say, 8 years, they could not do much, especially with now children that they have to take care of. So there is a challenge. There'll always be a transgenerational challenges that they will face. For example, the children will undergo the same because the mothers cannot pay them in school, cannot afford. There are several things I can talk about CRSV survivors. So the first recommendation I say is holistic approach in dealing with CRSV, that is ensuring that after the event, medical support is given. Psychosocial support that has been said by others have been given. The legal support for those who need should be there. And social support. So, and livelihood, and livelihood. So all these, when you give to a survivor of sexual violence, that is concrete enough to make them survive and move on, to make them move on, start life, to really bring them back, almost back to the situation to the position that they were in before. And this should not be done in isolation. Please, always, when organizing any program for survivors, consult them. What this will mean to talk about survivor-centeredness. Do it in consultation with survivors. Some survivors only need the legal section. If their perpetrators are apprehended, they are happy, and that is their reparation, that is their healing. Others need economic support, others need medical support, others need all. So if you do it with them, that I normally say, look for, that's a process of like the way doctors do, it is by understanding what the problem is, that's when the right interventions can be done by service providers. I think that's very key for CRSV. And when we talk about survivor-centeredness, are we really practicing it? I've heard a lot, I've been in conferences, I have listened to, but when you come on ground, it is just said there. Is it being practiced on the ground? Are you consulting survivors? Are you involving them in everything that you do for them, that you intend to do for them? This is very key. And then, majorly, those are those are what I can, those are the issues I can bring on the table. Unless there is any question, and it over to Doreen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris, and we appreciate as a CRSV survivor being on this call and sharing your experience. experience, and talk about the importance of survivor-centered approaches in programs, in policy, in different interventions. We appreciate you and we send you so much love. Thank you again, Grace. So at this point, I know there are so many questions and so many comments that are coming in. Please keep them coming and our panelists will make an effort to respond to you. And any of those that are not responded to will be responded to by SIHA. A number of resources have been shared in the chat box, a number of reports with statistics for those of you that have been asking about statistics and Amnesty for access to additional. And in 1 minute each, I would like to request you to conclude. So I will start with Jacqueline Nasiwa, and then Adla, and then end with you, Flavia. So Jacqueline, your 1 minute concluding remark.
Thank you, Lauren. I think in my concluding remarks, as you suggest, maybe SIHA should support us to convene meeting of policy for victims and witness protection, and also so that we can discuss strategy of how we can be able to create awareness on the transitional justice process, including at the state level, understanding of these two laws. But women generally, as it's posted in the chat, they are not to play. So convening a meeting to strategize on engaging on the transitional justice process is very important, so that we can support women when the public consultation, also support reparations program for victims. Currently, we are having a recruitment of the commissioners going on with the Ministry of Justice. So this convening can also help us as women to mobilize and ensure that the 3 women who are going to be part of the 7 commissioners are selected with our input and also with our scrutiny. Thank you. And thank you for this convening. It's timely.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, and we look forward to having those 3 women continue to raise and amplify these issues. Adla? No.
كده سامعني؟
We don't hear you.
كده سامعني؟ كده صوتي مسموع؟ طيب أنا بس في الدقيقة دي عايز يعني لأنه هو الموضوع يعني مشعب كبير شديد. الناس اتكلمت عن أرقام، اتكلمنا عن حصانات، اتكلمنا عن عدالة، وما أعتقد يعني موضوع زي انتهاكات العنف الجنسي أثناء النزاعات يمكن نغطيه في ساعتين. لكن مهم انه كل مره نحن نتطرق لواحده من المحاور. انا بالنسبه لي يعني بس الكلام اللي عايزه اقوله انه نحن كمنظمات مجتمع مدني، منظمات نسويه، ما عندنا حل غير انه نتكلم في القضايا اللي في قضايا الانتهاكات اللي بتحصل للنساء. ما في حل، نحن لازم نتكلم عنها، لازم صوتنا يكون قوي. ما في حل غير انه نضغط كل الفاعلين في انه الحرب بتقيف، في انه لازم نضغط في انه يكون عندنا موارد للحماية، في انه نضغط انه لازم يكون في عدالة ومساءلة للجناة. فدي واحدة من الحاجات اللي أنا بختم بها، لكن إن شاء الله يعني نتلاقى في منصات تانية ونتناقش في مواضيع أو في جوانب مختلفة. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Super. Thank you so much for the opportunity to reflect again on this conversation. And really, it's been an honor to be part of this space. My closing remarks will be along the following lines. 1, I'm so encouraged that we are beginning to break the silos especially across geographies. As someone who has a bird's eye view of the different contexts and a crisis that we have in the region, I'm always a bit frustrated when the conversations tend to be about only a particular country. And I'm not saying that there are no geographic specificities, but I think it's so important that we connect our African struggle as a people of Africa, as a women of Africa, as a feminists of Africa. So I'm really thankful for SIHA to actually bring us in this space where we're beginning to do that. And I'm hoping we can continue to think along these lines. My next point is really around the question of justice. Whenever we do work around conflict-related sexual violence in the region, we always ask the question, what does justice look like to you? I'm really glad Grace in Sudan with you touched upon this. And you realize most of the time it's in two facets. One is usually around the question around immediate survival needs, the question around livelihoods, the disruption of livelihoods. We've seen that in Ethiopia, in Sudan, in DRC, and so on and so forth. And then if you dig deeper, you realize that once the question of livelihoods is addressed, there's a bigger question around punishment, retribution, a guarantee of non-repetition, and that takes time. That takes more investment. So I'm really glad you're beginning to also look at that question, because I think it's super important that you acknowledge them and therefore their dignity, but at the same time, there's really the need for accountability. And then lastly, I think as feminists, as women's rights organizations, I think it's important that we do not get confined on the question of conflict-related sexual violence only. We need to broaden our analysis to the bigger questions around power, patriarchy, militarization, things that are more systemic and broader, that define how our societies are, and that begin to explain why women are constantly in the situation that they find themselves in, and not in any way to discount that sexual violence also happens to men and boys. I think it's important that we are also part of those bigger discussions, peace processes, power sharing processes, acknowledgement of other various atrocities that are happening, killings, looting, destructions, bombings. All those also affect women and girls that and have an impact or are directly related to the violence that they experience in the form of sexual violence. And then lastly, it's that what you're seeing in conflict is a reflection of what society is even during relative peace. So if we don't address sexual and gender-based violence and the place of women and girls in societies, regardless of whether they're in conflict or not, then we will miss the point. So it's important that whenever we have moments and windows to address social norms, why do we value women and girls less than the way we value men and boys? Why is gender diversity such a taboo in our communities and societies? Then we begin to address the root causes as to why we find ourselves in the place that we find ourselves today. Thank you so much. It's really been an honor to be part of this space.
Thank you so much, Flavia. And I just want to conclude by saying what we've had today makes it clear CRSV is not incidental to war. It's a deliberate strategy of domination, repression, and control, whether in Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, or across the Horn of Africa. Women and girls' bodies continue to be weaponized as battlefields, while survivors are left with stigma instead of solidarity and impunity instead of justice. This is the third of SIHA's It's Not Your Fault in a series. It's again shown us that silence is not an option. Each conversation is part of a growing regional platform, connecting struggles across the borders and demanding action where there has been neglect. On behalf of SIHA Network, I want to thank our speakers for their courage, their clarity, and all of you for engaging so deeply around this issue. Let's leave this space with renewed urgency and commitment to stand with survivors, to fight impunity, and to demand a future where CRSV is no longer tolerated or ignored. As we conclude, we do have a feedback survey that is coming up on your screens for those of you who are joining online, and those of you that are joining in the hubs. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation and for contributing to this very rich and deep discussion. We have a survey. We would like to hear back from you on how you feel this conversation impacted on your life, on your work, and also hear some recommendations on how SIHA can continue to engage with you beyond this space. Thank you so much to everyone. And as we conclude, I would like to encourage all of us to turn on our videos, wherever you're joining us from, to take a group photo, to remember this conversation and to see how we can continue to connect with you thereafter. Those of you that have not had your questions responded to, please reach out to info@sihanet.org or leave your email in the chat before you leave this space, and we'll be happy to connect with you. So on this note, I would like to say thank you again to everyone that has been part of this conversation, and would like to take a photo with you as you complete that online survey. So reminding you again, please turn on your video if you're able to, and if you're not able to because of the internet challenges or accessibility, that's all right. We'll go ahead and take the photo. And if you are not comfortable with having your photo taken, please keep your video off. So we'll do this in a minute. So if everyone can turn their videos on, and the SIHA host will confirm that the picture has been taken. I have got confirmation in a minute. We will be done with the photos. All right. I want to again say thank you so much, and we hope to see you in the next session of our series, which will be happening on 2nd of September. And I will request the host to put up the QR code with the feedback survey. And for those of you that would like to access this using a link, feel free to use the link. These survey questions have been translated in all 4 languages. So please feel free to use the language most accessible to you. Thank you again, everyone.